Welcome to the Labyrinth. I am your host Pratham Pada. My guest today is Yohan Tengra, the founder of Anarchy for Freedom India. He works for a health startup called iThrive in the field of functional medicine and nutrition science. Johan, welcome to the show.
Hey Pratham, thanks for having me on, man. Pleasure to be here.
So, how are you, man? Are there any lockdowns where you're staying right now?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, the gyms have opened up and the salons have opened up, but they've opened up for a specific time. So, in terms of lockdown, no. I mean, like there's freedom of movement. You can take your car, you can travel, but nothing's properly opened yet. Like the restaurants have opened till 4 o'clock, so things are still kind of in the middle. Like it's not a lockdown, but it's kind of like a lockdown still. Yeah.
So, I'll get straight to it. What's your view on the pandemic and the lockdowns?
Man, that's a big question that I've actually studied a lot since the thing started. So, I think since the early days of this thing starting itself, I think it is very clear that this is something that affects primary people with pre-existing health conditions, and most of the people who are doing fine. I mean, not extraordinary healthy, but even just people who don't have basic like metabolic dysfunctions or chronic inflammation and things like that. They handle it well. I mean, they're mostly asymptomatic, and some people contract mild symptoms. And the primary people who get deeply affected are, I mean, age is the biggest risk factor for SARS-CoV-2 infection. So we've seen that very clearly. And people who are staying indoors more, having really low vitamin D levels. There are many factors that kind of play into that, but early on itself, it was pretty clear that this is not as much of a problem as the fear hysteria that has been created. Like I remember going out on the day of the voluntary lockdown, and I made a video basically saying that this is not like the Modi just come out and said that you guys should stay at home and everyone's staying at home. So it was kind of I kind of suspected at the time that they were doing it to see how the public responds, and as soon as the public responded positively, they just went for a lockdown the next day itself. So yeah, I mean, the early on itself, I had opinions on it, but as more time passed, as I continued to kind of wait for the science to develop, because in the early days as well, there are a lot of unknowns that they kind of took advantage of and said that, okay, we don't know this, so it's better if we take precautions and all that. And I mean, fine, for a while it's fine, okay, 3 weeks to flatten the curve or whatever it was, but it just extended into like a constantly existing thing where they can just play with numbers and statistics that I'll share my opinions on as to how they've done that. And you can just keep creating waves of case demics. Like really, it's a, if you ask my opinion in basic gist of it, I think what we've experienced up to now has been a case demic. And in terms of a definition of it being a pandemic, I think that what we are facing right now is very similar to what was experienced in a hospital in New York in 2006. So if I can narrate that story a little bit, it'll kind of show you my view on what's really going on right now, because what's taking place right now has already happened in the past. So I'll just give you the story, and then you can make better sense of what I think about this. So in 2006 in New York, in a hospital called Dartmouth Hospital, basically some doctors suspected that there was a whooping cough epidemic that was about to break out, because this one guy was coughing incessantly. And then they saw that a couple of other people started coughing near him in the next week and all. So they thought, they were very concerned. They thought that there's a whooping cough epidemic that was about to start. So they got paranoid. They went and tested the entire hospital, like all the people that were in the hospital. They went and tested them with PCR tests, which is, I mean, what they're using to this day. And they found that around 250 people were positive. So they basically said it's an epidemic, and that we need to give all these people antibiotics, because whooping cough is a bacterium. So they gave everyone antibiotics, and they gave everyone vaccines for whooping cough. And they declared a victory, because I mean, like after you get vaccinated, you can't have the issue. That has always been the thinking. So they said, okay, woohoo, we won against this. There was an epidemic, and we found it, we solved it, and it's over. Fortunately, some smart scientists, and doctors at the hospital and researchers sent the samples to CDC later on, where they actually, wanted to do culture testing, which is the gold standard for testing infectious agents. Where, I mean, the PCR is kind of, you're taking like a small section of the genome and like trying to find the target, whether it's the RDRPG, the spike protein or whatever. They're trying to find a target of the genome, which is very large. It's like 29,700 base pairs, and you're trying to find something small from that. But culture testing is acknowledged to be the gold standard. I mean, I've read many scientific papers on this, and going back all the way, even up till now, I found a paper when I was doing my research on the testing thing that was published by Indian scientists from Delhi, who were involved in the a couple of universities in Delhi, and they were saying that virus culture is the gold standard for testing infectious agents. So back then they send these samples to the CDC, and the CDC could not even find whooping cough. Like they could not even culture whooping cough bacteria from even one sample. And that's when the people at the hospital got an email, and they declared that the whole thing was a dud, and they created a pseudo-epidemic. Because instead of actually waiting for a test that would take a long time, bacterial culture tests, sometimes it can be done in a couple of days, but sometimes it can take weeks to grow. So instead of going for that, because the PCR tests give them quick results, they used it fast, and they landed up finding a bunch of false positives. And then they basically declared an epidemic, and they gave everyone vaccines and antibiotics, and that was done. So you can find the article on this in New York Times. It was called "Faith in Quick Tests Leads to an Epidemic That Wasn't," and you'll find many people from that time. I've quoted this in my paper. I'll share my paper if you want later on.
Yeah, sure. I can put that article in the description of this video.
Yeah. So we worked on a really in-depth paper 1.5 months back that I finished a month back, and I kind of premiered on my channel. And that's where I've referenced this, what I'm talking about. So over there, I've included quotes from infectious disease experts from John Hopkins, people associated with the Gates Foundation that time, and they're all saying that we know this is a problem. And this example wasn't the only one. That at that time in 2007 or something, when the article was written, they're acknowledging that this is not the only case. They even had a term for it. They called it a pseudo-epidemic, and they said that there have been many like this across America, and there is no proper the CDC doesn't keep a record of this, and but it's a widespread problem. They knew it existed. At the end of the article, they were like, okay, but we don't know how to solve it. There's always going to be a trade-off between using a test that gives you a quick result compared to waiting for one that takes longer, and things like that. So that is the conclusion of the article. But at the time, they properly acknowledged that that these tests are unreliable. There's no getting around that. The PCR test has a rate of false positives. This is not controversial at all if you actually read the papers on the PCR test and how they compare it to viral culture, which is what I'll come to now. So I think more or less that situation has happened on a global scale, because in that hospital, because they suspected someone with whooping cough, but it was confirmed later on through gold standard testing that these people didn't have whooping cough. So that kind of goes to show that yes, you can have overlapping symptoms, and maybe there's something else going on. Maybe they had influenza. Maybe they had some other upper respiratory tract infection, which is why they were coughing, right? So that's what they concluded then. So in a similar way now, we have a pathogen that is typically causing upper respiratory tract infections, which happen in a wide variety of conditions. So if you're going to go and basically test the entire world for something which is something we've never done before. I mean, just to put this into context, we've never gone and mass tested the entire world for a pathogen ever. This is just something that's not happened. So if you're going to do it for the first time, we know that if something 1,000 people in a hospital, if you test them, you can have this problem. Imagine that being just stressed out to the whole world, and the entire world running PCR tests, and then just think of the number of false cases you would have because of that. And I mean, even at a very basic level, without even going into the technicality of the PCR test, just because it tests some you test positive for something, it doesn't necessarily mean you're sick from that. So I can do I was just kind of seeing a couple of test reports from a lab in America that we kind of send our patients to when they have chronic gut dysfunctions and stomach problems and things like that, and they do PCR testing for a wide variety of microbes in the gastrointestinal tract. And many times we see this in reports that you'll have it's not just one microbe that comes positive, you'll have a bunch of them that kind of come positive together. So in a similar way, if you do a PCR on someone for upper respiratory tract infections, and you test let's say you test them for SARS-CoV-2, but you also test them for garden variety coronaviruses, you also test them for influenza, you also test them for whooping cough, you do everything which basically can affect the respiratory tract. And then if you just find SARS-CoV-2, fine, okay, I can say yeah, probably that's the issue if this person has symptoms. But because they've invented this whole idea of asymptomatic transmission, and they basically made everyone believe that you can transmit disease even without being sick in the first place, that's what extended the problem that would have originally existed just to people who are manifesting symptoms and testing positive to basically the entire world. And that's in part, I think that's been at the crux of this whole issue, because to be honest, every test has false positives and false negatives. Like that's just the problem with testing in general. So it's not like the PCR is unique in that regard. I think that with the PCR, the problem is a little bit more, because it's kind of happening in a cyclical fashion. So instead of it being a yes no test, it's more like a thing where they kind of expand and expand and expand the genetic material, and then there's an arbitrary cutoff that they have where they decide, okay, someone's positive or negative. So if they change the cycle cutoff as well, you can just change how many people will be positive and negative just based on that. So I know for sure earlier, like in India earlier, we had different tests having different cycle cutoffs. And at some point, I think late last year, early this year, Balram Bhargava like came out and said that, okay, we've standardized the cutoff and it's now 35. So coming to that whole problem of, say, the gold standard for testing for infectious pathogens, they've done solid science. Like earlier this problem wasn't explored, but I found a host of papers on PubMed that basically looked at comparisons of PCR positive tests with viral culture tests. Like they were comparing how PCR results compared to virus culture, and paper after paper, you see, I mean, you can find even meta-analysis of this where they've compared 30 papers together. You'll find like good randomized control trials looking at like large sets of tests, comparing them to virus culture. And you'll find that, like as the cycle threshold starts to go up, so at 25, some papers find that it has like a 70% match with virus culture. If you take the cutoff to 30, it drops further to 20% accuracy, and if you take it to 35, it drops to like 3% accuracy. That is one of the papers that was used by a court in Portugal to basically like rule that the PCR tests can't be used for diagnosis, and especially like restriction of liberties based on that. So because of these problems, and because we know, like the PCR has an issue in comparing with the gold standard, and it doesn't match it accurately, and especially if you're going to have a country they're going to go around testing just normal people who don't have any manifesting any symptoms, and if you run high cycle counts in them, you're going to lead to seeing like a lot of cases in the numbers. It's all about the numbers, right? That's how a perception of how severe the problem is actually comes to us. So if that's what's making it into the numbers and the foundations are so hollow, then I mean, anything that's built on top of that is going to be flawed in some way. So that's what we see in the numbers as well, and that's why it's so difficult to take the numbers at face value. Because I mean, we've done RTIs. Like personally, I'm involved in this, and we've sent RTIs to them just asking the ICMR, okay, like give us a day by day, week by week kind of flow of how many tests you're doing, and like then we can compare that to like what's going on in terms of like deaths and all, and see like what's or cases, and see like, okay, does it have a correlation, like is the number of tests actually increasing the caseload, and vice versa if you're cutting it down. Because it's not like the testing has been consistent ever since, right? There are periods when the testing is ramped up, there are periods when the testing is brought down. So just in a very practical common sense way, if you're going to go around more testing more people, and if the test has such a high rate of false positives, you're going to find people who like who don't have anything but like test positive, and they become a case, and then they test their contacts, and then like the contacts become a case, and even if they don't have any problem, they're still supposed to quarantine. And I know so many people in the second wave who were told to go to hospital just because they tested positive. Like I know of cases like this, and like famous people who were told that, okay, like you need to go get admitted to the hospital because something will happen to you. Like it's not happened yet, but because you've like tested positive, we've caught it early. So before something happens to you, like start taking prophylaxis and like just go get admitted. So I think a lot of the problem that has been caused now like has been because of like the faulty use of PCR testing. I'm not a person who denies the existence of the virus. So I mean, through my research personally, I do believe that this is a novel pathogen that like is different from other coronaviruses, that has a unique symptomatic profile. So that's been my view for more than a year now. Although initially I was a little bit skeptical of that, but as I learned more about the subject, I became pretty certain that the virus does exist, and it does affect people who have health issues. But from my understanding of what's going on, I think that because the data is made so uninterpretable because of the faulty way in which tests are used, we'll never know like who actually had it or who didn't. Like if they used the testing in a better way, like you can drop the PCR cycles down, you can improve, like there are scientists who've written papers on how you can improve the PCR by implementing something called the Mikey guidelines. Like Stephen Buston is one of the premier sort of experts in the PCR around the world after Carrie Mullis died. and he's written papers on like how you can make the PCR better, and none of his, I mean, guidance has been adopted till yet. So I think this is primarily a problem of the case and the deaths being manipulated because of the testing. I think that there have been genuine people out there who have been affected because of the virus, but that number is very small compared to, I mean just on a very like practical basis, you can find articles from the media talking about how many of these cases have been asymptomatic. And in Mumbai, in the second wave, they reported that 85% cases were asymptomatic. In Bangalore, I was shocked when I saw the article, but they basically said that the municipal corporation figures suggest that 97% people were asymptomatic, and they're calling them patients, right? So they're automatically assuming that just because someone tests positive with the PCR, they're a patient. And so this whole idea, again, as I said, of asymptomatic transmission has come up, and this is what I took a deep look at in my the paper I authored as well, because I had heard for a year that asymptomatic transmission exists and it can happen, and I was kind of I was, of course, I thought that is propaganda, but I didn't really have like evidence to show that, because there's controversy about Maria Karkov coming out last year and saying that the evidence doesn't show that asymptomatic transmission exists, and the media kind of pounded her for that. So that whole controversy was there. But then I really kind of delved into the science and looked at the papers on asymptomatic transmission and pre-symptomatic transmission as well. So there's this other term in the scientific literature where they separate asymptomatic transmission and pre-symptomatic transmission. So pre-symptomatic transmission is when the period like right before you're about to manifest symptoms, and that's when they say that you can actually spread, because that's when the virus is like just about to start replicating in the body. So even the studies for that, they're really flawed. I mean, I found an entire paper where scientists are just like critiquing the way in which these studies are being done. They're using models, and like they're using PCR as an endpoint, right? And they're not even reporting the cycle counts they're using in these tests. So there's like a whole host of problems in how these pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission studies have been done. Like they were mainly done in China in the early days, and they locked everyone in their houses, so the contact was kind of increased, and that itself created the problem. Like they're using the asymptomatic transmission studies to justify the lockdown, whereas the studies themselves were done when the lockdowns were done. So I mean, you kind of can't entangle, like separate both of them. So I found a lot of problems in the asymptomatic transmission and pre-symptomatic transmission studies that I did reference in my paper also. And I've done a lot of research on the virome itself. So I kind of wanted to understand the scientific knowledge that exists about the virome, because we know a lot about the microbiome, but we don't necessarily know a lot about the healthy human virome that exists in people, in normal people. Like a lot of research hasn't been done in that area. So I found a couple of papers where people who've been in this field for a long time, they were basically saying that we need a lot more money and science going into figuring out like what does a virome of a healthy person look like what kind of viruses are present in that. And there have been few studies that have been done that kind of gave me an idea that okay, someone can carry a virus that's causing a disease, but they don't necessarily have to manifest symptoms. So there was this one study that they did in 2014 where they looked at the blood DNA virome of around 8,000 people, and they did de novo sequencing on their blood. And these were people like who didn't have any kind of history with any kind of infection or anything like that. And they found like HIV in their blood. They found hepatitis B, hepatitis C, papillomavirus, HTLV, adenoviruses. They found many things in their blood basically, and these were like perfectly healthy people. And this makes sense with what we understand about host factors now. Like we've seen in the whole, since the time COVID has started, we've seen many host factors that impact, how the virus will express in your body. And I mean, there are many important levers like vitamin D or insulin sensitivity, like how obese or how slim you are, and
Exactly.
factors like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So don't you think instead of worrying about COVID-19, we should really be worrying about diabetes and obesity and heart diseases?
Yeah, but that's the problem, right? With the way they've portrayed the idea of germ theory in the public. Like I do believe that microbes impact health, but the host factors are much more important than the microbe itself. Like there's so much in our control that we can do to reduce our chance of like manifesting severe symptoms, which are really in our hands. So I mean, just like basic things like having your vitamin D levels topped up and like at least above 35. There's good science on that. There are interventional trials on vitamin D that have been done. There's good science on selenium, and like selenium even before COVID. Like there's good science on selenium inhibiting viral replication for things like Epstein-Barr virus and other pathogens like that. So there's always an interplay between nutrient sufficiency, between metabolic factors, between things like that. And I mean, even diabetes ties into immune aging as well, and how well the immune system is functioning. The microbiome is very important because, like, the microbiome is kind of the eyes and ears of the immune system. So the microbiomes is what sends signals to the immune system. The microbes are actually like an army that's spread out all across your body, and they're scanning for pathogens that kind of come and infiltrate. And if you have a healthy microbiome with good alpha diversity, then it's going to send a message to your immune system via cytokines, like inflammatory cytokines. And then the immune system kind of kicks in, and that's when you get your innate immune responses and adaptive immune responses after that. So if someone has a dysfunctional microbiome, that's going to impact their, how their immune system works. So there's a big responsibility people have, that they can do things to reduce their risk. And it's not like if I go and if I come into contact with you, and even if you have COVID, if you have like confirmed COVID and you're coughing and you cough on me, I can still be with you and not contract anything. Like I know I had it because I have like inflammatory issues in my body since a long time that I've worked to deal with. But I was not following a good diet at the time. Like, I mean, this happened to me in last February of last year, and I knew that time itself that COVID is something new. It's not just like a normal flu, like people say. It has a different symptomatic profile. It mainly affects the lungs. I experienced all of that. Like, I experienced primarily like a cough that was centered in my lungs that got stronger and stronger, and eventually kind of repeat. And I mean, I knew at the time itself, because I was following a lot of functional medicine people, that zinc lozenges are very effective in inhibiting viral replication, and I was going and topping my vitamin D levels up and all, and I was able to suppress my symptoms for the whole time that I had it. Like, it was like, you put a lozenge in your mouth, you stop coughing for 2 hours, and then once it dissolves, it starts again, and you take it again. So I kind of got through it in 3-4 days just by doing that, even though I had inflammatory issues, and I was drinking and I was smoking and all of that at that time. So that's why I kind of landed up manifesting it. But I was with my partner, and she didn't land up getting anything, even though, like, it's not like she's the like epitome of health or something, but she's just like normal person who doesn't have any issues. And she was with me when I was like coughing on her and all. And it kind of, you see the practical experience like that. Like, people don't necessarily have to manifest anything at all. And she didn't manifest anything, even though I was with her. So there's a practical responsibility on the receiver, which is a conversation that's not been had in this whole time, that everything is about, okay, if you have it, you should stay isolated, you should not give it to someone. But what about the other side? Like, even if I give it to you, there are many things that are in your control, that are your responsibility to do to make sure that you don't fall sick. So it's a two-way street. Like, it's not just like I should be in hiding, but like, this is how we've been all, right? Like,
I should be in hiding, I should double mask, I should vaccinate. It's all yeah. But do you think the young people with the healthy immune system need to take vaccines?
I mean, this is again a personal choice. I'm not necessarily anti-vaccine, but I believe that a lot of fraud has taken place in the way vaccine science has been done. Like, I mean, just to give some examples, vaccine trials don't use placebo groups. Like, there's a common problem, and I mean, the mainstream scientists always say that it's an ethical issue and we can't use saline placebos in vaccine trials and things like that. But I don't think, I mean, from a very scientific perspective, I don't think you can like figure out cause and effect if you aren't using saline placebos. Like, the whole point of using like randomized placebo-controlled trials is so that you can figure out causality, right, and actually assess for safety. So these things aren't used in vaccine trials since a long time. Like, you struggle to find studies on vaccinated versus unvaccinated people. Like, the CDC has always refused to do a study like that. So I mean, like, I don't want to go into those issues a lot out here, but I think that for me to be convinced that I should take a vaccine, it would require like efficacy measured in terms of actual endpoints and not intermediary antibodies, as well as like proper safety trials that are done and people being followed for a couple of years at least. But I haven't seen science like that necessarily. But for the COVID vaccine, that's even, I mean, the problems are kind of multiplied a lot, because I've taken a deep look at both the trials that they did here for Covaxin as well as for Covishield. And I mean, there's just so much that's wrong, right? Like, Covaxin was approved in India. The phase 3 trial didn't even start. Like, they just did phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 only looked at 400 people, out of which 300 people got different doses of the vaccine. And then like there's this 100 people group that got an aluminum adjuvant as a placebo. And then Covishield, Covishield did get called out for the way it did their trials. But in the phase 3 trials, they basically like grouped data from different countries. Like, which the trials were done in different ways. And then they grouped all of the data into one study, and then they analyzed that, which is something that, is not only scientifically sound. Even like a lot of articles came in, like, I think Science Magazine and Wired and all, that were calling AstraZeneca out for the way they did their trials and all that. And even the AstraZeneca vaccine, they used the meningitis vaccine in the control group. So I've seen like so many problems that have taken place in the vaccine trials. Like adverse events have happened, but they've kind of been spread between both groups equally, so they don't become statistically significant. So then if they basically can say that this is not statistically significant, then it's not a problem. And because of the way they've kind of manipulated the adverse event reporting system, like the AEFI system in India, people don't know that the fact that they could have a vaccine injury. Like it's not like conspiracy theory to think that you could get a vaccine and have an injury. Like there's been a lot of literature published on vaccines and the associations with chronic diseases and things like that. So it is possible to have like long-term side effects. It is possible to have effects in the short term, which you won't necessarily pick up in the phase 3 trials because you're looking at a small number of people. Like even if you're looking at 25,000 people compared to the size of the population you want to give it to, it's still very small. And I mean, I can show you papers where like physicians are talking in 2011 about how they don't trust pre-licensure trials. So even for the vaccines that go through like 5 years, 10 years of kind of phase 3 trials and all of that before coming to market, many physicians and pediatricians have the opinion that like phase 3 trials aren't adequate to actually assess for safety concerns, because even for past vaccines like the rotavirus vaccine, basically even after the vaccine like crossed phase 3 trials, they discontinued the vaccine because of the phase 4 marketing surveillance data, because that's when they started to see that there's an association between the vaccine and intussusception. Like that's a problem in the GI tract where the intestines get bound up together. So there are many problems that can come up after the vaccine has been released into the market, because the trials aren't, powered enough to actually show you like, some things might be rare, but you might pick them up and it's done on 1 million people compared to 25,000 people. Like even if it's say, let's say the side effect was 1 in 50,000, you're not going to see it in a trial of 25,000 people. But if you're going to do that to 1 billion people, you're going to find those effects, happen a lot more because of the kind of scale that's involved. So these are very mainstream problems that academics and doctors and people like that have written about in the literature that you don't necessarily hear about. But I mean, just to think about it, like they approved Covaxin before any phase 3 trials were even done. The safety study was only done on the phase 1 trial, which looked at 400 people. The phase 2 trial didn't even use a control group. They were using different doses of the vaccine, if you look into that. So, I mean, how can you say a vaccine is safe based on phase 1 and phase 2 data and give it to like approve it for entire population of 1.3 billion people? I understand it's an emergency or whatever. So fine, like, if you want, like, I'm a libertarian, so I don't like kind of believe that the state should like regulate this thing. Like if people trust it, if it's been developed and people want to go and take it, even if it's only done like no trials also and people still think they want to go and take the risk and take it, like that's fine, that's their choice, right? But to then come and like intimidate us to take it and then say it's safe and effective and you need to take it because like if you want a job or if you want to go travel or things like that, that's messed up, man. Like, they can't do something like that. So that's the thing I'm against. I don't necessarily have a problem with people going and taking the vaccines, but there should be informed consent, man. Like people should be told like exactly how the trials have happened, what the real risks are, and things like that. I don't think that's been done. So for young people, I don't think that. I mean, to be honest, like we have good science now on like the immune system as well, and like how the T cells and the like memory B cells and antibodies and things are functioning after people are contracting the infection. So I mean, we have a good science now, and even people who have been asymptomatically infected also developing good immune responses and like memory responses. So it's I don't think like it's highly unlikely that if young people have been moving out for the last year or two, they've probably contacted this thing. And I mean, we can just we don't have this kind of testing in India, but in America they've started a panel where they're looking at like CD8 T cells, CD4 T cells, and it's commercially available. So people out there can actually go and test if they have like T cells and B cells for SARS-CoV-2. And if they have it, I mean, like it's going to last for a long time. Like just for example, we have a paper where people who developed T cells from SARS in 2003, like healthcare workers, their T cells worked 18 years later against SARS-CoV-2 and recognized SARS-CoV-2 and dealt with it. I mean, we've seen papers where antibodies aren't even required for viral clearance. Like the viral clearance happens much before the antibodies are even developed. So clearly, like antibodies are important, but they aren't the end all and be all of immunity. Like you have other immune factors that are involved in resolving if you tend to get infected also. So I've seen this pattern, which I mentioned in the interview with Dr. Kakalaya also, that whenever the test can be used in a way to restrict people's rights and liberties, they ignore all the uncertainty. So you have the same thing happening with the PCR. There's a risk of false positives, false negatives, but leave all that. Like we need to be cautious. We need to be overly cautious. So even if the uncertainties are there, it's fine. Like you do it, and If you're positive, you have to like lose your job, you have to stay in quarantine, you have to like do everything. Okay, but as soon as tests can be used to give people freedom, like okay, let's say an antibody test, like why are they vaccinating people? Even if the end goal is antibodies, if the end goal is antibodies, then like why not test the unvaccinated people and see who has antibodies and then allow them to roam, right? So I mean, if you apply apples to apples and if you have the same standards, then they would do that. But if you see since last year, the rhetoric has been that antibody tests can't be used because we are not certain about how long the immunity lasts, and you have all these kind of arguments. But as soon as the vaccine comes out, it's fine. Like you go take it, and you can have your vaccine certificate, and you can start reintegrating back into society. So I think, I mean, if people practically observe this without, I think a lot of people tend to have like pre-existing skewed biases. Like they tend to have certain views about people who question vaccines, and automatically think of them as anti-vaxxers who follow like deranged conspiracy theories and are like overly paranoid about everything. And then I mean, even the people who are kind of against vaccines, they automatically kind of tend to just dismiss every vaccine that comes out without doing any research on that. So I think from both sides that we should have more rationality and actually look at like what's going on to assess our like individual, and it's all about individual risk to benefit, right? Like I mean, no central health authority, like I mean, we'll talk about this when we have the discussion on libertarianism, but we know through economics like socialism doesn't work. Like it always fails because of the knowledge problem, that like few people can't necessarily have like the adequate knowledge that's needed to solve a large number of people's problems. The more decentralized the system is, the more points of decision making you have, the better the thing is going to function, because you're going to have like knowledge that's distributed in the population, and people are making their own risk to benefit kind of actions based on like what data they have locally available that's relevant to them. So I mean, in a similar way, like if you apply this problem also, a parent and like an individual is, I'm going to know best for me, like what's my risk of developing SARS-CoV-2, and then if it's worth it for me to go and like risk and take the vaccine, right? Because even like the thing that's happening right now, like even after getting the vaccine, if you have priorly developed immunity, they are assuming that just because you'll have more antibodies, that means it's a better immunity, right? But I mean, this is pretty common. Like if you go and test anyone for autoimmune diseases and you look at their antibody levels, a higher antibody level is more concerning because they have like higher activity going on. So I mean, it's kind of it seems like a contradiction, but it's not, because when your body is trying to fight something, you'll have like a higher level of antibodies that are present. That isn't necessarily a good thing, right? So you don't necessarily want to have like antibodies constantly floating around in your bloodstream all the time. You have memory cells that will come around and make the antibodies when it's needed. So just to equate antibodies with immunity, I think is a large part of the propaganda, and this is why they're even able to skew their estimates of herd immunity, because it's like okay, if I'm using only antibodies in my sero surveys and I'm not looking at like T cells or things like that, then you can tend to have like okay, like 30% people have developed immunity, 40%, and then sometime after that you still like you kind of see it go back low, and they're like, oh, we're not reaching herd immunity now. But that's, you're assuming that immunity is antibodies, which is
Do you think we've all, sorry to interrupt, but do you think we've already reached a state of herd immunity?
It's, I mean, like look, I can speculate and tell you that mostly we have, because I know that like in India, like many people didn't really take this seriously. They were on with their lives last year, and like especially after that August period started, like people got relaxed and they were roaming out, and like people have been all over the place. And I mean, this is a respiratory pathogen. It spreads pretty easily if someone kind of has symptoms and all. So once things are in community spread, you can't necessarily like control the infection successfully. Like I mean, this is why all the WHO documents that went before this, when they were talking about how will we take policies if a influenza pandemic comes up, they recommended against lockdowns and against contact tracing and all this stuff. And suddenly after this starts, like all the science is suddenly like upside down, which is something I can touch on later. But yeah, I mean, if you ask me, I think that we have like pretty much reached herd immunity. And I mean, that might sound contradictory if you think, okay, Johan, if we reach herd immunity, why did we have the second wave? So that's kind of the discussion where I would say that like these waves have been systematically created because of the way in which the testing and the death certificates have been manipulated. Like that's been my opinion. Like I just saw an order that came out from the government of Meghalaya where they are basically saying that okay, in a COVID ward, since everyone who's there is either tested positive or has symptoms of COVID, anyone who dies, we'll automatically assume it's a COVID death. So if you like the problem is primarily diagnostics. Like when people say okay, this person died of COVID, earlier before the pandemic, if you went and questioned, like if you thought about it, you would tend to go to different doctors who would give you a different diagnosis, and oftentimes like they would be competing. Like some doctor would say, okay, this guy's wrong, it's not this, is this. But in this time, like just because of the way the PCR tests have, and I mean even the RAT has been promoted to kind of diagnose this, people think you can just test positive, and if it's that, then it means you have COVID and nothing else. I think that's kind of the medical fraud that's involved in this. But because of that, I think the way in which the tests have been manipulated, and the way in which asymptomatic people have been forced to be tested, which is something that was peculiar in the second wave, I think that we saw these kind of correlations between the testing being manipulated on the case and death figures skyrocketing. But I also think there are some other factors that contributed to the deaths happening in the second wave, and I think the vaccines were primarily responsible for that. Because I mean, to be honest, look, if you ask my scientific opinion, I can't tell you in a cause and effect way that the vaccines caused the second wave and all that. But to be honest, because the trials haven't been done in a robust way where we would be able to make that out, like there's a correlation between the vaccine administration in many countries and the case and death figures changing after that. So, is the vaccine the cause? Like I can't say scientifically. We would need well-powered trials to tell us that. But definitely, like there's a big cause for concern, because I mean, like I know many people personally, and like people might dismiss this as anecdotal evidence, but to be honest, that's all we have. And anecdotal evidence doesn't mean you can just dismiss it. Like it's a way to give you a signal that okay, something's going on. Like we need to do proper studies to figure out cause and effect and all that. But because the money is kind of being controlled by the governments and the people who are controlling the scientific research, and they influence where it goes. We don't have solid science coming out that can give us proper answers on whether the vaccines are causing the deaths. And even the causality assessment, like this is the main thing that kind of I've done research on. But the way in which vaccine deaths are being attributed to like say like actually being caused by the vaccine, like the deaths that are happening after the vaccine, the guidelines that basically they use to determine causality were systematically changed a couple of years back. Like I don't know if you've come across Dr. Jacob Puliel, but he's written a couple of papers on this in F10,000 journal that he did in 2018, I think, where he was kind of talking about how because they changed the guidelines, no death other than anaphylaxis, like other than someone having an allergic reaction from the vaccine and dying, no other death gets classified as a vaccine death, because they basically like they had an old classification system where they had a possible and probable criteria where the person could possibly die or probably die. Because I mean, when you're trying to analyze cause and effect on an individual, you can't say with 100% certainty. Like there's always it's always a spectrum. Like it's very likely or probable, possible, unlikely. It's like that. So they had this whole Brighton criteria which they used before 2013 to kind of determine causality assessment after vaccines. And ever since that has changed, they like Jacob Puliel did an analysis on, I think in the AEFI kind of reports, 353 deaths had taken place from many different vaccines, and this is before COVID, right? And not even one of those deaths they were able to attribute to the vaccine, because the kind of assumption that's built into the classification is that if in the phase 3 trials they don't see a statistically significant increase in the vaccine arm compared to the control arm, then any death after that that happens is a coincidence. That's how the causality assessment is set. And even for adverse events, like if they don't see statistically significant changes in the trials for the adverse events, then any new adverse event happening after that will not be counted as a signal, and it will not be associated with the vaccine. So because of the way in which they've done this, you can't possibly pick up new signals like after the vaccines come to market. So they can just dismiss everything and say this is not because of the vaccine. Like people don't even sit to ask like, okay, how did they make this decision? If you actually sit to explore that question, you'll come across the guidelines, and then when you sit to think about the guidelines, like they totally skewed them, right? So to give a very good comparison, how does the diagnosis happen for COVID? Okay, like someone say has a COVID infection, you test them PCR positive, and then if they die, that's enough to put COVID on that certificate. Now, of course, this is the doctor's own opinion, and like they kind of they have integrity. Many of them have integrity, and they don't put COVID on the death certificate if they think something else is going on, even if the person has tested PCR positive. But many of them, I mean, this is the ICMR guideline. The doctors have been given the liberty that if someone has tested PCR positive, you have to put COVID as the underlying cause of death. It's called UCOD in the kind of number they've given to that. So that's the low level of causality assessment. Like that's the bar that just testing someone PCR positive, you can attribute the cause of death to this virus. But when it comes to the vaccine, like the bar is set so high I mean, it's almost impossible to prove that something's happened. So I mean, that automatically gives you the perception, just because of the way in which the standards are different for both, that the virus is deadly and it's killing so many people, but the vaccine's fine and it's safe and effective because of the, like, bar that is changed. So if we had both compared at the same level of causality assessment, then you would be able to make meaningful comparisons between vaccine mortality or like the virus mortality. But I think, yeah, these are fundamental problems that have given the people the perception that the vaccines are safe and effective. Whereas if they actually used like the old classification system, which is Brighton, then we would see a lot of more deaths being attributed to the vaccine than have been currently.
Yes. So far we spoke mostly about the virus and the vaccine, but the reaction to this virus has been, to lock down cities, not once but twice. What do you think the economic effects of these lockdowns are, and how do you think it's impacting our small business owners?
So I mean, since I have a big foot in like studying libertarianism and Austrian economics, I mean, I know for a fact that you only have savings and capital production that happens in a society when people actually save, like when they defer the time preference, like when they actually decided, okay, I'm not going to spend this money now, I'm going to defer my time preference, I'm going to save it, and then I'll be able to create something bigger in the future. That's how wealth creation happens. Like, wealth creation doesn't happen because some bureaucrat in the RBI decided to print more money at some point. That's not how real wealth is created. Like, real wealth is created when people defer the time preference and they choose to do something in the future instead of the present. So if you see the impact of the lockdowns, very like economically speaking, what they've done is they've basically stopped people from the entire trade cycle. Like, you can't buy and sell, and you can't basically, there's no prospects for the business people to even invest or save because the outlooks are so grim, and people are not being allowed to come and buy even when they have the money to do that. They're being stopped from doing that. So definitely that's a big setback for the small and medium sized businesses. And we've kind of seen that happen. And I mean, if this is probably a subject for another podcast, but I do believe that like this whole thing hasn't been about the virus at all, and there's a larger agenda of basically transforming the economic system into technocracy, which is something that academics like Anthony Sutton and Patrick Wood and other researchers have done a lot of work on. But there are basically like people who are involved in top positions of power that want to create a resource-based economy, which is, I mean, a technocratic system where a few people have a resource monopoly on the resources of the planet. And this has been part of the sustainable development goals of the UN, and they basically want to, in the name of sustainability and climate change, they want a centralization of resources happening.
Yes.
So
I
yeah.
just read on the WBCSD.org, that's World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They have written a controversial article that says avoiding a climate lockdown, and they're
Yeah.
basically planning to have lockdowns even after the pandemic. What are your
Yeah, I mean,
thoughts on this?
there have already been talks in Germany where they're talking about climate lockdowns, and like you'll see a lot of op-eds that have come out in mainstream media that are talking about, oh, the COVID lockdowns weren't good enough, like they helped to reduce pollution and all that, but like we need more, like we need more to save the planet. So the way I see it is that I mean, look, when it comes to the subject of climate change, like there's a lot of debates that take place, to be honest, whether it's, I mean, is it anthropogenic, like how much impact do humans have in creating warming, how much impact do like greenhouse gases have, and like especially carbon dioxide, and what its impact is. So leaving aside the science of that, like even if climate change was happening, like if it was actually happening and humans were responsible, which is something I think is debatable, to be honest, but even if that was true, the fact is that there are people in positions of power who are using that crisis in order to push certain agendas. That's the main focus that I take. So whether or not someone believes in, it's just like the virus, like whether or not someone believes in the virus, you can see that there are people who are using that to push certain things on the population that they've always wanted to push. So I mean, this is a quote from Obama's economic advisor when he was in power, Rahm Emanuel. He said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So there are people who are waiting for crises, whether they're engineered or whether they naturally happen, and that helps them to justify certain things. So I think the climate narrative as well as the virus narrative have played into that. So although I believe in the virus, and although I mean I'm sort of don't take strong sides on whether climate change is human or not. I don't think it's human, if you ask me a personal opinion, but that's something that people need to make up their own mind on. But these crises are being used in order to push certain agendas on the people that have been laid out long before these things even started. So there's a whole history of this that you can trace back to the eugenics movement, and then like how that morphed into soft eugenics in the name of family control and like sort of family planning, population control, things like that, and how that morphed into the entire climate movement. And they have a very Malthusian mindset of like, okay, there's too many people and the people are growing exponentially and the resources are not being able to keep up with that. So in order to kind of solve these problems, we have to centralize power, and we have to make sure that there's management of resources happening, and it all has to be done in a way that we respect the planet. So there's going to be carbon credits and all that. So I don't want to go off in a tangent into those things. Probably we can discuss this when we talk about the Great Reset agenda and all that at a later time. But yeah, that they are talking about climate lockdowns now, and the aim of the lockdowns is to like continually in a growing way, basically attack the independent livelihoods of people, so that the people are forced to become dependent on the state in some way. And then once they can do that, then they can very easily control people, because you will depend on them for survival. So you have to do what they say. Basically, they want to usher in a technocratic pseudo-scientific dictatorship. I mean, they're basically weaponizing science and using a very twisted version of science in order to push their control agenda. So once they make you dependent on them, which is what the agenda is, like they want to push most of the world into poverty, and even the banking system, and how that also connects into this, which is something that maybe we can talk about later. But the basic plot is they want to make people dependent on the state, and then they want to tie us into the social credit system that China kind of started, but they want to export that worldwide, where facial recognition and biometrics and like a social credit score will all be tied in together, and that will be connected to your vaccination status, and that's what will basically decide where you can travel, so and how you can live, how much money you get, all of these things. Like we can see practically in China what the impact of that has been. Like people who have a bad social credit score have real life impacts. Like they can't get their children admitted in school, or they can't travel, or they're put on a no-fly list, or things like that. So it has real world impacts, and that's something they want to export, like China, into a global model. And when you follow the money and you see what players are involved behind this, and how they're working in different countries, it becomes pretty obvious that there is something more going on than just a virus and things like that. So definitely I do think that like climate is the whole issue of climate change is going to be manipulated, because to be honest, if you think that by scaring people for a personal risk, okay, like if I scare you and I tell you this virus is going to come to you, and like it's going to basically, like if you get it, it's going to start deteriorating your lungs, and you're going to have oxygen issue, and then you're going to need a hospital, so you start panicking, and you're able to just like basically quarantine or wear 2 masks and things like that. If I told you that the planet is going to collapse in the next 10 years if you don't control your carbon emissions, or if you don't have less children, or if you don't live in a smaller house, think of the impact that would have. So just individual fear on an individual basis, and my interaction with one-to-one with different people, if people can get so terrorized by fear of that, imagine if they're told that if they don't do what the authorities say, the planet is going to collapse, and that they'll be able to justify things in a much easier way if people don't become street smart to how problems are used to manipulate people's actions and actually take freedoms and liberties away from them, which is what we're seeing that's taking place right now.
Yeah, but how can we dispute climate change when 97% of scientists, that's the line, right? 97% of the scientists say that climate change is real. And personally, I think it's probably true too, but maybe I haven't done enough research on the other side of why climate change could not be real. But yeah,
So there's a factor, right? Like we're talking about either anthropogenic climate change or naturally occurring climate phenomena. So I mean, we've seen in the past that we've had massive disruptions in weather, even when there were no humans around, and the CO2 levels were much higher in the past than they are now. So I mean, I don't necessarily, because that the climate change debate opens up a lot of kind of doors for us to go into, which is why I said that whether or not kind of people believe that it's happening or not happening, there's a question to be asked about weather manipulation as well. So I mean, there's a lot of research on geoengineering, and sort of the Air Force having the technology to manipulate the weather, not necessarily the climate, but weather systems in local areas. That's they have the technology to to manipulate those events and things like that. So it's a question of, okay, are humans responsible for it? Is climate change happening? How do we measure the mean global temperature? There are a lot of debates that are had about that. Like, okay, how do you measure like the global average mean temperature? It's not as easy as it sounds. Like there's a lot of kind of factors that are involved in that, which is why I said it's something that's debatable. And whether or not people believe in it, I think at least we can see the fact that there are people who want to kind of use that in order to push certain agendas, and that's how it will be manipulated. Yeah. So I mean, and even like I kind of come down to a fact where the scientific opinion on something is a different thing, but from my view of first principles and the non-aggression principle and things like that, like whatever the scientific truth about a certain subject might be, but that doesn't preclude like individual rights. So like even if climate change is true, okay, like what's the solution to solve that? Is it possible to give authority to a bunch of people to have more rights than us, so they can take all this stuff and like restructure society and have like a global centralized database where a tiny number of people are owning everything? Like that's clearly against just basic first principles, right? Like we don't have rights, they don't have, sort of, we can't give someone a right that we don't have. That's what we'll speak about when we talk about anarchy. So that's why, because I believe in the non-aggression principle, and because that's my first line. Even if like climate change is happening, the solutions have to be in a realm where we respect people's rights. Like you can't take away liberties for them in the name of these problems that are very difficult to kind of solve in that setting, because of the power dynamics that are involved in the transfer of power, which is and I believe that like governments don't rightfully exist because we can't give these people rights that we don't have. So in my view, it's kind of immoral of them, or it shouldn't be possible for them to be able to dictate our lives, even with what's happening right now with the entire COVID scenario. Like in my view of individual rights, if we lived in a world where people understood like sort of natural rights and things like that, and first principles, the entire response to this would be different. Like people would be making their own choices. Like, okay, let's say like I believe this is a deadly virus and I own a business and I don't want you to come inside unless you give me a vaccine certificate and all. That would be my right because it's my property. So I'll decide like how I want to deal with that. And if people believe that that's not kind of sound, or that's violating their liberties in some way, they can stop giving the guy business and he'll go out of business, and you'll fund someone who kind of supports you that way. So the market would tend to decide that way. So I apply the same thing to the climate problem also. So, okay, if climate change is happening, then like, okay, how do we go about if CO2 can be proved to be causally related to the increase in global average temperature, which is again like it sounds very easy to prove that, but then it's like this whole host of problems that are involved in that whole thing that don't make it so easy. So it's like the pollution issue, right? So pollution is a problem, but then how do you go about prosecuting? Like, okay, if a tiny number of people are emitting a small amount of CO2, but that's collectively kind of coming up to cause a problem, like how would you prove that? And it's also a question of, okay, like for me to be on the planet itself, like I've had to breathe, right? So that's my right. Like I can't live without breathing. So like anything that's gonna come and take that away because it existed beforehand itself, like it's immoral for you to come and tell me that I can't have children because of something that is a prerequisite to life itself, right? And you can't have rights if you don't have like people doing that. So yeah, it comes down to a problem of first principles. And even if people acknowledge that climate change is a problem, again, as I said, there's a lot of research on geoengineering about governments being able to manipulate the weather. So is it really, are the weird phenomena happening right now because of CO2, or is it because of natural changes? Like we know that volcanoes and termites and oceans also contribute to a huge load of the CO2 that's produced on the planet. And the sun is involved in that as well. And the sun is kind of left out of the climate models. If you kind of go and research that, and you see how Maurice Strong was involved with the UN, and how we set the guidelines for how climate research would be done, and how the sun was kind of left out of the models. There's a whole host of problems in that, which is why I think it's a debatable subject. But I'm glad you brought that up so that I could kind of share my opinion.
Yeah, coming back to the COVID issue, do you think if we remain unvaccinated, we would be treated as untouchables? We would be discriminated against by
That's what
the public?
I think that's where we see it going, right? Because the propaganda has been so ramped up, where people are made to believe that if someone's not vaccinated, they're a threat. Like they can carry the virus and they can transmit it to you. And because people believe that if they've taken the vaccine, they'll not transmit the disease, which is again something that's totally not true. Like they've not done in the trials. Like they've not seen if the people who are being given the vaccine actually reduce the risk of transmission. Like they've not done repeat PCR testing, And again, as I said, even PCR testing is not adequate to study transmission and all. But even if you assume that it is, okay, they've not even done that in the trials. Like all they've done in the trials is literally in the phase 3 trial. Like I'll not even go into phase 1 and phase 2 because they aren't powered to show anything. Okay, but if you look at phase 3 where they did 25,000 people, let's say for Pfizer and Moderna, and how they determined efficacy, they basically took 12,500 people, vaccinated them, 12,500 people got a placebo, and then they compared both the groups, and then they saw like, okay, how many PCR positives plus mild symptoms were happening in both the groups. So they had a cutoff of like 180 people, and then in those 180 people out of 25,000, they saw like how many people from that are in the vaccine group and how many people are in the control. And this is how they came up with these huge numbers, like 90% effective and 95% effective, because they're doing relative risk comparisons. Like they didn't even do absolute risk comparisons. If they did absolute risk comparisons, the absolute risk of contracting COVID in the non-vaccinated group is less than 0.5%. And the absolute risk of contracting COVID in the vaccinated group is probably like 0.3% or something like that. So if you compare those two numbers, like, I mean, I'm not like quoting verbatim, like, but it's somewhere in the range. If you compare, like, let's say for example, in the unvaccinated group, you had 150 people who tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 and had mild symptoms, and in the vaccine group you had only 30 people that came. So if you're going to compare 30 to 150, it's going to make it look like shit. That's a huge number. But you're just doing the analysis on 180 people and you're doing a relative risk comparison. The absolute risk comparison would be 30 divided by 12,500 and then 150 divided by 12,500, and then you would land up with some tiny decimals that you would compare and see what the absolute risk analysis is. So because of playing with statistics like this, and this is not the first time that they've used relative risk comparisons to kind of skew people's perceptions. Like they've done this in the past also on many drugs in order to show the benefit, and even like demonizing some drugs and showing the risk. They use relative risk comparison. They make it look like, oh, this drug increased the chance of getting this by 50% or 70%. It sounds very big, but because people don't have an understanding of statistical chicanery and like how they can use this to manipulate perception, is why right now people believe that, oh, it's like if I get the vaccine, then there's a 70 or 90% chance I'm protected. But they firstly, like they didn't even look at hospitalization or deaths in the trial. Like this is not controversial at all. And I hear many influencers keep saying this, that the vaccine will reduce your chance of getting hospitalized and death. Just because, even if I assume, like let's say, okay, in the vaccine group, it reduced the chances of them contracting a PCR positive and mild symptoms. That doesn't mean that's going to lead to a reduction in deaths and hospitalization. That's an assumption. That's a leap you're making. We're not seeing that in the trials. They're not evaluated that. So that's not being looked at in the trials. They've not seen whether the vaccine will actually stop transmission from happening or not. This is something that's being looked into in trials now that have been started like a month back or something. So we don't know the answers to these things. And so for someone to say that, like, if you're unvaccinated, you're a threat to me, when I can prove with good amount of science, like, okay, test my T cells, test my antibodies, and then see, like, if I have immunity or not. And then if I have it, like, fine, treat me like how you treat a vaccinated person. Like, I have superior immunity to a vaccinated person. My immune systems recognize the whole virus. I have immunity against the nucleocapsid protein. I have immunity against the spike protein. I have immunity against everything. Right? Like when your immune system develops memory, it breaks down the virus and it makes like antibodies against like every single protein that's present in the virus. So comparing that to one spike, I mean that's clearly superior and more. And this is not controversial. Like I've been part of vaccine debates that have taken place like before this, like before COVID. And even the people who are like pro-vaccine, like people like Peter Hotez and like people like that, like who've been involved in vaccine development and all, like they would always acknowledge that natural immunity is better than vaccine immunity. But the only point of contention is, okay, but like what is the cost of natural immunity? Like what is the collateral damage? Like how many people are being affected by the infection, like getting a full-blown infection? Compared to that, with a vaccine, you're not going to get the infection. So that is always a debate. But these people never like kind of question that natural immunity is better. Like everyone knew natural immunity is better than vaccine immunity. Vaccine immunity is like vaccines were created to mimic natural immunity. That was the whole concept of developing vaccines in the first place. So to think now that like they've totally twisted the science. I mean, this is not controversial if you read the literature, but when you see how these things are reported in the media, it's like they just totally act like we do, like natural immunity is inferior and we don't know how long it would last. But vaccines are robust and they're going to surely produce antibodies, so that we can use that to reopen society. So yeah, man, those are my thoughts on the subject.
Yeah, but most people would just reject your answer because most of them are go by, what's the popular opinion. They have their own, the word, I think the right word is mob mentality or herd mentality. You would get ostracized by society for what you just said. So how do
Yeah, but
you
that's, I mean,
react?
people, like, the majority has always been wrong, right? Like, if you see for anything, like even this COVID crisis itself, like, forget majority opinion, like even appeal to authority is a logical fallacy. So even, like, I mean, if I have to make a point, I'm not going to tell you like, oh look, like this doctor agrees with us saying this, so that's why I'm right. Like, I'm going to give you my reasoning behind that. That's how we argue when it comes to science, right? And for people to come and say like, okay, because people believe something is right, like, I mean, people can believe anything. Like, people have believed in like absolutely crazy ideas going back to the history of, human evolution. So just because people believe something, like, people have believed in religion for, like, like however long. And like I have so many problems with, religious beliefs and things like that myself. And that's what made me skeptical. Like, that's how I started questioning things, is like after getting skeptical of religion to begin with. So, like, people's beliefs really doesn't matter. Like, I pursue the truth, and like, what I can prove with science and like like rational thinking and logical reasoning. And if that contradicts popular opinion, then so be it. Like, people have scientific paradigms have been overturned. People have believed things that, like, scientific revolutions have happened where people surely believe something's right, and like, it just comes and uh, something comes and overturns that whole thing, and there's a new paradigm that takes place. Like, there's a whole history of scientific thought and how paradigm changes happen. So yeah, I mean, because people don't think that deeply. Like, they just look at someone in authority or some expert, and like they believe in what they're saying. Like, even the whole argument, right? Like, right now we have experts on both sides. So we have people like Fauci and Burks and all these people who basically push the mainstream narrative on everything, that okay, masks are the only way you can protect yourself from the virus, and the vaccine is the only way that you'll have immunity, and like lockdowns are good, and like the whole deal, right? And then I mean, you have people who have questioned this, who have, like, proper scientific temper, like people from the Great Barrington Declaration, Martin Kulldorff, Sunatra Gupta. I mean, there are good scientists like that who call this whole thing out. Like, the entire Panda network has, kind of brought together a great group of scientists that are, very academically pushing back against a lot of the statistical manipulation that's gone on into this whole thing, and the manipulation of the testing, and the risks and dangers of masks, and the efficacy questions over masks, and the problems with the vaccine. And these people aren't anti-vaxxers, man. Like, they've always
Hmm.
believed in vaccines for their whole life, but it's because in the way that these things are being pushed now is making even the people who always believed in vaccines kind of get skeptical and say, okay, like, what's going on? These things aren't making sense out here. So I think that's a good sign for, the way things are going, because even people who've tended to believe, like, have a very, I mean, I know people who have a very religious mindset when it comes to vaccines also, and any questioning about them is kind of frowned upon and name called and things like that. So even people like that are starting to kind of have difference of opinion, especially just when it comes to the COVID vaccine. Like, they might kind of be totally okay with everything else on the schedule, but this one's raised a lot of eyebrows, specifically because of the way, the hurry in which these things have been developed, the way to which it's being, like, the population is being coerced to get it. It almost makes you feel like, okay, like, like, why do you so desperately want everyone to get it? Like, is there something more going on? That's kind of the thinking that they're forcing the people to think in that direction, which is what I think is a good thing. Yeah.
We hear a lot of politicians using words like the Great Reset, New World Order. Even Prime Minister Modi, I believe, had used the word New World Order in one of his speeches with regards to COVID pandemic. How do you interpret these words?
Okay, so this is again going into the realm of so-called conspiracy theories, which I personally haven't shied away from them, because I think this is a big problem that a lot of people who have a typical skeptical mindset tend to make, that they apply, like, really hard claims for, say, cause and effect and things like that to people's like intentions, and people having motives, and people conspiring to do things like that. And I think that's a big error that a lot of skeptics make, because when you're trying to analyze plots and motives, and people conspiring in secret to do certain things, you can't rely on like hard sort of scientific evidence for that. You have to kind of look at sort of circumstantial evidence becomes very important when it comes to that, when you're trying to analyze people's motives. So I mean, when I I've been on this for the last 6 years, and I've been studying conspiracy research, and I mean, I've been studying a lot of I've tried my best. Other people who kind of tend to dismiss conspiracies just out of sight. I've the moon landings and all of that. So I have a good idea about like how they approach these things, and I mean that's the biggest mistake that I think these people are making. But when you just look, I mean, if you just try to think from a very blank slate, like okay, if this was actually going on, like if you consider the possibility that this is possible, then how would we prove that, right? And so you would have to kind of start investigating and looking that you can find on this, and there are academics that have written in great detail. Like I mean, you can go and look up some of these people, but people like H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell and Jack Attlee, Aldous Huxley, sort of people like that, George Orwell. They've written years back about like in great detail about what's going to happen. Like if you read some of Bertrand Russell's writing, like The Impact of Science on Society, H.G. Wells has written the book on like the open conspiracy and things like that. So there are a lot of people in the power structure and elite groups who've been writing for a long time about like how they want to like sort of transform the system and steer the kind of politics of the world in a certain way. And you have people like, I mean, just for an example, like you have David Rockefeller writing in his book Memoirs that was published I think before 2000, and he's writing in his book that okay, like if people accuse me of a conspiracy to create a one world government, if that's the charge, I'm proud of it, and that's what I'm involved in. Like this is in his own memoirs, right? So I mean, I see a lot of effort being put by people trying to dismiss conspiracies as saying that okay, it's intellectually lazy and people tend to make a lot of assumptions and all. But if you actually read these people's writings, they're openly saying it. It's just that they have a spin on it. So in the same way, like if you study the Great Reset, it's just a rehash of what these people have always called the New World Order. It's gone by different names, right? So it's always been known as the New World Order, and a lot of people are involved in conspiracy research. But then now it's called things like the Great Reset, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and things like that. So if you study like the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset agenda and the history of the World Economic Forum and how the Club of Rome was involved in founding the World Economic Forum, the people involved in that, and you start looking at things like the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, you'll find technocrats and people who are like sitting in positions of power that have been combed by certain interests to come into these groupings, and like they're actually coordinating to push this agenda, and they talk about it openly. Like if you read the World Economic Forum's kind of manifesto and goals, Klaus Schwab openly talks about like people having brain chips in the next 10 years. And I mean, like this whole talk of transhumanism and really man merging with machines and cybernetics and nanotechnology. Like nanotechnology is an exploding field of science, and people tend to kind of dismiss the idea of nanotech being in the vaccines and things like that. But I mean, like if you look at DARPA, they have applications that they've developed for the last say 5 years. Like there's one application called hydrogel where they can infuse the stuff in your body. It can literally surveil like your glucose levels, your hormones, and like it can keep a track of various biomarkers in your body. It can connect externally to a centralized device and communicate that information to a central database. And these capabilities exist. Like microchips. Like I've been involved in this for so long, and microchips are thought to be like this crazy conspiracy theory. I know people who like laughed at me years back when I told them that like, there's an agenda to like microchip people. And I mean, now we have the Pentagon talking about microchips being developed so that we can catch COVID before it happens. So everything always has an ostensible reason and a real reason. The ostensible reason is the reason they give to the public, so that there's a justification for what they're rolling out. And then there's a real reason that's always been behind the scenes taking place. So if you study the history of this, like not even conspiracy theorists, but people like Carroll Quigley. Okay, he was like an insider historian that was involved, with a lot of these groups. He was a mentor to Bill Clinton. He wrote like a 1,300-page book called Tragedy and Hope, and that he literally like his one of the seminal chapters in his book, and the quotes from that, he's talking about international bankers, conspiring to create a one world order, like a different kind of economic and political system, where a few people basically have a lot of influence and they dictate the laws that are taking place around the world. And this is like one of the biggest insiders who was a mentor to Bill Clinton, and he wrote a very long book on that, detailed describing their influence and how they manipulated the world wars and all of that. So people tend to dismiss these things as conspiracy theories very quickly when they haven't really bothered to explore the literature that's available on the subject and the time for which it's been available. And we have people writing in great detail for years. I mean, like when David Icke's name comes up, like people think he's a mad guy who believes in shape-shifting lizards and all. And I have many disagreements with Icke myself. But if you read his writings in the 1990s, he's talking in great detail about things that are going to happen now. Like he's talking about so many other things that are happening now that like he was considered mad, but like he's talking about microchips and things in the 90s, okay, and the cashless society and like digital currencies and all of that. And we see those things unfolding now. So it's not just in theme, but when you go and read these people who've been thought to be mad or who've been portrayed in a certain way, you see that like they were bang on with a lot of things they said. I mean, like you don't have to agree with everything everyone says. So you can have like disagreements in certain areas, but many people have done good work in some areas that I pick and choose. Like I go with my discernment, and wherever I think someone's done good work, like I kind of go with that if the evidence backs it up. So there is definitely that an agenda that has been set like for a very long time to create a technocratic system. They call it technocracy. Started in the 40s, and Harvard was involved in it at that time. And they basically like want to create a resource-based economy where technocrats and experts are controlling everything, and politics is gone, the ballot box is gone, democracy, the legal system, all of that is gone. You basically have a tiny managerial class that proclaims themselves to be scientific experts, and then they control and micromanage every aspect of the economy. So everything is centralized, all the production and distribution is managed. They have like a surveillance dragnet that basically enables them to see like how much each person is consuming and all of that. And they want to transform society in that image into a top-down centralized system wherein there's a monopoly on resources these people have. They're rationing everything to us, like like how much universal basic income we get, and like how we get it. Like what's the ideology of the people? Do they believe in like what we are basically doing? Do they follow our laws? Do they have a good social credit score? Have they been updated with the vaccine? So you think about it in terms of dependence, right? Like if you don't have to rely on anyone to work and get your income, you don't have to basically follow any prerequisites or something like that. But when you're relying on someone to give you money, it's basically do as we say or we don't give you that, right? So that's why I think like even a lot of people who are skeptical of conspiracy theories and tend to see them as intellectually lazy and all, I think at least at this time when like that there's so much that's happening that people have said that's been proved to be right, I think people should kind of start with a blank slate and question a lot of that. But if you look at the Great Reset agenda, they openly talk about a lot of the stuff that's considered as conspiracy theory. They talk about like carbon credits and like basically transforming the economic system into like the Trilateral Commission itself that was created by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. The goal of the Trilateral Commission has always been like a transformation of the economic system, a total transformation of the economic system into a centralized sort of one world kind of system. That's been the open agenda for since the time it was founded in the 70s. So there's an interplay between like the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg, CFR, the UN, and WEF. Like the WEF basically had an agreement with the United Nations to push the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals also sound very rosy, and they're portrayed in a language. Okay, we don't want any poverty for anyone. We want everyone to have the best health and all. But when you go and read the fine print, it's like things are termed in a very like devious way. Like I'll give you an example. So they talk about like, for example, let's talk about individual rights. So they say that okay, like individual rights are important, but people need to give up their individual rights for the benefit of the community. So a lot of the stuff like they want to take our liberties away, but they frame it in very carefully sophisticated propaganda that's delivered. I mean, this propaganda is not for the masses. Like the masses get the stuff that comes on the television, but they carefully craft this stuff for the thinking people who kind of get duped by a lot of this stuff. So I would say that there definitely is an agenda to bring in a technocratic scientific dictatorship, one world government. That's what the new world order basically is, and the Great Reset is also pushing towards that. And yeah, in my opinion, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just everything that we said, like even vaccine passports, for example. Like if you go and read my media articles, like last year when we were doing protests against all of this stuff, like I was talking about like vaccine passports back then, and I had like people are thinking of it as a conspiracy theory hai, aisa kuch hone nahi wala. And I'm telling them back then, like okay, like the masks are just like programming you so that when the vaccines come, like you can just replace no mask, no entry with no vaccine, no entry. Like how difficult is that for them to do? And I even had like there's this I think bioethics researcher called Anand Bhan out here. I don't know if you've heard of him, but in like there was a media article on me, and then he was saying that there are other concerns about the vaccines, but this is a little far-fetched and it's not going to happen and all. I mean, this is what is exactly happening now. So it's like, even the things that are being called conspiracy theories 1 year back are just like, continuing to happen. So conspiracy theories are nothing but, you know, I would say, like, of course, there are conspiracy theories that aren't true. So it's not like everything that's a conspiracy theory is automatically true. Like, I disagree with a lot of things that people believe to be conspiracies. Like, I don't think the moon landing was a hoax. I don't think the earth is flat. I don't think dinosaurs aren't real. I don't think viruses don't exist. Like, a lot of idiots believe in that stuff. Okay. But there are genuine conspiracies that, I mean, there are like that you can pretty much prove when you look at the amount of, the money flows, the circumstantial evidence, and you follow the history of these groups back and what they say and what they're doing. You can prove this stuff, but it's just that, like, very few people actually take the effort to go and investigate, and it takes a lot of time to piece these puzzle pieces together, which is why people think that, oh, it's just nonsense. And, like, people are paranoid. They want to believe, like, this is the common explanations I hear, like, people want to believe this stuff because it makes them feel better, and, like, it's a psychosomatic thing and all that. When you look at the evidence, like, it's right there, man. Like, either you can choose to believe it, or, like, people don't. That's their choice. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for your time. I think that concludes part one of my conversation with you. For the audience, I just want to say, if you found this podcast useful, please subscribe. And I also want to say that this is part one of my conversation with Yohan. Part two will be more of his worldview, anarchy, libertarianism, etc. So, Johan, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Pratham. Pleasure to be here, man.